In August 1315, guards at the Chateau Gaillard dungeon smothered Queen Marguerite of Burgundy to fake a natural death. Her life ended because of her illicit carnal encounters at the Tour de Nesle with the two Downey knights who had paid the price on the torture wheel. The daughter she bore was abandoned by the court, as they believed she was the product of those filthy secret knights. The assassination order placed on Marguerite, issued specifically so King Louis X could take a new wife, irreparably severed the royal bloodline, plunging France into the brutal 100 Years' War. How did a carefully engineered royal marriage, designed specifically to secure a holy bloodline, become the exact instrument that annihilated a 300-year-old dynasty? King Philip IV governed early 14th century France through rigid administrative centralization rather than traditional chivalric ideals. Instead of relying on entrenched feudal barons, he completely revolutionized the state apparatus. He built a rigid bureaucracy run by university-educated lawyers who held no inherited lands. These ministers owed their unwavering loyalty exclusively to the French crown. The king viewed prolonged conflicts as a severe drain on national resources, especially while fighting protracted wars against the wealthy cities of Flanders. Needing to avoid instability on multiple fronts, Philip secured his borders using diplomacy rather than deploying armies. He treated his children as high-value political currency. By leveraging their marital contracts, he peacefully absorbed neighboring territories into the royal domain. The most critical defensive sector was the eastern frontier, where Burgundy acted as a vital buffer against the Holy Roman Empire. This massive territory was politically fractured into two regions. The Duchy of Burgundy answered to the French king, while the County of Burgundy legally owed allegiance to the emperor. Philip needed unquestioned control over this entire zone to prevent imperial incursions toward Paris. To lock down this border, Philip married his younger sons, Philip and Charles, to Joan and Blanche, sisters from the County of Burgundy. The Central Alliance, however, was designed for Crown Prince Louis, who was contracted to marry Marguerite. Born around 1290 in Dijon, Marguerite represented the highest tier of European aristocracy. She was the daughter of Robert II, Duke of Burgundy, who was one of the wealthiest and most militarily capable vassals on the eastern frontier. More importantly for the French crown, Marguerite possessed an impeccably pure lineage through her mother, Agnes of France. Agnes was the youngest daughter of the late King Louis IX. In 1297, the papacy had formally canonized Louis IX as a saint of the Catholic Church. The Capetian dynasty promoted the ideology that the French monarchs ruled by direct divine mandate. By bringing Marguerite into the primary royal line, King Philip IV was re-injecting the sanctified blood of Saint Louis directly into the veins of his future heirs. Marguerite was classified as an asset of unparalleled dynastic value. She was also a product of a distinctly specific cultural environment. The ducal court in Dijon operated as a vibrant cultural center. It was deeply steeped in the refined, stylized ideals of chivalry. The Burgundian nobility actively sponsored troubadours, poetic composition, and the philosophy of courtly love. Marguerite was a beautiful, proud, and extroverted young woman. She was completely accustomed to a court life defined by social engagement, aesthetic beauty, and public celebration. In September 1305, the negotiations between the French crown and the Duchy of Burgundy culminated in a formal dynastic marriage contract. The 15-year-old Marguerite was officially married to King Philip's eldest son, the 16-year-old Crown Prince Louis. The marriage contract dictated the transfer of staggering wealth. Marguerite brought a massive financial dowry and the political compliance of her father's duchy directly to the throne in Paris. In exchange, she was guaranteed the position of Queen Consort of France upon the death of Philip IV. The legal reality of her new position was rigid. Marguerite was not embarking on a romantic union. Within the mechanics of Capetian statecraft, she functioned as a political guarantor, ensuring her father's continued allegiance to royal directives. Furthermore, her primary function for the state was purely biological. As the wife of the crown prince, she was tasked entirely with securing the Capetian succession. Her sole duty was to produce legitimate male heirs to ensure the unbroken continuity of the dynasty. When Marguerite departed Dijon to take up her permanent residence in the capital, she encountered a severe cultural shock. The Palais de la Cité sat isolated on an island in the middle of the river Seine. It functioned less as a royal residence and more as a heavily fortified administrative command center. The Parisian court operated under the severe, austere oversight of King Philip IV. The atmosphere was defined by legal audits, bureaucratic administration, and constant suspicion. This was the era of the king's political purges. Marguerite's early years in Paris coincided with the systemic arrests and trials of the Knights Templar. The destruction of the wealthy military order served as a constant reminder of the king's total, unyielding authority. In this environment, innocent entertainment was restricted. Aristocratic women were bound by inflexible codes of religious morality and rigid protocol. Marguerite possessed no privacy. An exceptionally efficient network of royal clerics and state informants monitored the royal household on behalf of the king. She was barred from participating in political discourse, isolated from the mechanics of power, and expected to fade quietly into the background of the palace. Her new husband provided the final, most jarring contrast to her upbringing. Prince Louis, known historically as Louis the Quarreler, possessed a physically frail constitution matched by a sullen temperament. He lacked intellectual curiosity and held open disdain for the poetry, art, and music that defined Marguerite's education in Burgundy. His pursuits were entirely physical. He focused on hunting in the royal forests and leading grueling military campaigns on the northern borders. When not engaged in warfare, he dedicated his energy to jeu de paume, a bare-handed precursor to tennis played in enclosed stone courts. Louis pursued these activities to the point of severe physical exhaustion. He possessed no desire to engage his young wife in conversation or courtly diplomacy. Marguerite found herself isolated in a hostile administrative fortress, surveilled by her father-in-law's agents, and tied to a husband who showed zero interest in her culture or her companionship. The stage was set for a profound psychological deterioration, one that would eventually push the young princess toward an extremely dangerous rebellion. This severe emotional deprivation, compounded by the sheer sterility of the Capetian administrative machine, pushed Marguerite past the point of passive endurance. The continuous surveillance and her husband's blatant hostility transformed her initial cultural shock into a deliberately calculated, desperate need for personal agency. The French royal court under King Philip IV was not designed to accommodate the chivalric ideals or the social vibrancy she had been educated to expect. It was a sterile, relentlessly regulated environment engineered for the execution of state power. Within this fortress, Marguerite's existence became defined entirely by a severe lack of political leverage, continuous state surveillance, and an increasingly toxic marital dynamic. Prince Louis exacerbated this toxic dynamic through his relentless physical absence. Viewing the marital contract solely as a biological obligation, he abandoned the capital to manage his inherited territories of Navarre, Champagne, and Brie. Furthermore, King Philip IV frequently deployed him to the northern frontier to command brutal military expeditions against rebellious Flemish cities. These prolonged military campaigns and administrative absences stripped away her last remaining shreds of influence, physically abandoning her to the mercy of her father-in-law's relentless intelligence network. When Louis did return to Paris, their domestic reality offered no respite whatsoever. Displaying utter indifference to his young wife, the crown prince made absolutely no attempt to bridge the vast cultural chasm between his grueling militaristic pursuits and her highly refined Burgundian upbringing. There was no shared intellectual discourse, no courtly affection, and no attempt whatsoever to integrate her into his inner circle of strategic advisors and high-ranking military commanders. The emotional deprivation of her marriage was overshadowed by a far more dangerous political reality: the failure to produce an heir. For the Capetian dynasty, biological continuity was the ultimate metric of a queen's success. The French royal house had maintained uninterrupted power for over 300 years, specifically because each king had successfully produced a legitimate male heir. This unbroken chain was known throughout Europe as the Capetian miracle. From the time of her marriage in 1305 until 1311, Marguerite failed to conceive. In the intensely dogmatic, religiously rigid environment of the medieval court, infertility was not understood as a medical or biological condition. It was universally interpreted as a moral failing, a direct sign of divine disfavor, or a punishment for hidden sins. As the years progressed, the pressure upon Marguerite became an existential threat. A barren queen-in-waiting was a useless political asset. The murmurs within the court grew louder, and the king's ministers began to scrutinize the viability of the Burgundian alliance. King Philip IV possessed the legal and diplomatic authority to petition the papacy for an annulment if the marriage remained fruitless. Marguerite faced the very real prospect of being publicly disgraced, legally cast aside, and sent back to Dijon in humiliation so that Louis could be provided with a more fertile bride. In 1312, Marguerite finally gave birth. The child was a daughter named Joan. While the birth proved that Marguerite was biologically capable of reproduction, it did not satisfy the demands of the state. The Capetian machine required a male heir to secure the succession without dispute. A female child introduced political vulnerability. Her future marriage could potentially transfer French territorial claims to foreign powers. The birth of Princess Joan temporarily halted the immediate threat of annulment, but it did not secure Marguerite's position, nor did it bridge the vast emotional chasm between her and Prince Louis. Subjected to severe psychological neglect and trapped in a hostile environment, Marguerite did not succumb to passive resignation. She sought out a localized support system within the suffocating walls of the Palais de la Cité. She found this solidarity with the only individuals in Paris who shared her exact cultural background and political predicament: her two sisters-in-law, Joan and Blanche of Burgundy. Joan of Burgundy was married to the king's second son, Prince Philip. She was older, exceptionally intelligent, and possessed a pragmatic, calculating mindset. Blanche of Burgundy, Joan's younger sister, was married to the king's youngest son, Prince Charles. Blanche was closer in age and temperament to Marguerite, vivacious, accustomed to luxury, and entirely disillusioned by the grim reality of the Parisian court. Together, these three women formed a distinct, tightly knit faction within the royal household. They were all products of the culturally rich Eastern territories, and they were all trapped in marriages to cold, uncompromising Capetian princes. Recognizing their shared isolation, they established a microculture within the palace, isolating themselves from the older, more rigid generation of court women. This alliance, however, evolved beyond mere mutual support. Marguerite and Blanche, driven by years of emotional starvation and physical neglect, made a carefully calculated, incredibly dangerous decision. They resolved to seek the intimacy, physical validation, and personal agency that their husbands had denied them. They prepared to step outside the boundaries of the royal marriage bed, initiating an operation that required breaching the most heavily surveilled security perimeter in France. Executing a clandestine affair within the Palais de la Cité was logistically impossible. The administrative center was crawling with the king's ministers, royal guards, and specialized informants. Privacy was non-existent. To successfully conduct their illicit meetings, the women required an off-site location that provided complete geographic isolation while remaining accessible enough to not raise suspicions during their daily routines. They identified their sanctuary in the Tour de Nesle, The successful maintenance of this illicit affair for 36 months relied entirely upon the formidable physical architecture of this specific building. The Tour de Nesle was not a palace, it was a military fortification. Constructed roughly a century earlier by King Philip II Augustus, it was designed to anchor the defensive wall of Paris on the left bank of the river Seine. It stood directly across the water from the Louvre Castle, which at the time was also a functional military fortress rather than a royal residence. In 1308, King Philip IV had purchased the Tour de Nesle and ordered extensive internal renovations to convert it into a private royal retreat. Despite the addition of luxurious internal furnishings, the exterior retained its formidable defensive characteristics. The structure was a massive cylindrical stone tower, standing approximately 25 meters tall. Its architecture provided two critical advantages for a conspiracy. First, the walls were incredibly thick, designed to withstand siege weaponry. This provided flawless acoustic isolation. No sound could penetrate the stone to reach the streets below. Second, the tower featured a restricted access system. It utilized a narrow, easily defensible spiral staircase and possessed windows that hung directly over the rushing currents of the Seine. This meant the primary approaches to the tower could be completely controlled or monitored by a single trusted lookout. The men selected to participate in this rebellion were not powerful foreign dignitaries or high-ranking feudal lords, as such figures would be closely monitored by the state's diplomatic surveillance. Instead, Marguerite and Blanche engaged with men who operated within the internal service layers of the royal household, Gauthier and Philippe Daunet. The Daunet brothers were Norman knights who held the formal title of equerries. In the hierarchical structure of a medieval royal court, an equerry was a prestigious position reserved for individuals of good noble birth, but it was fundamentally an administrative and logistical role. They were responsible for managing the royal stables, organizing the logistics of the prince's retinues during travel, and overseeing the procurement of horses and equipment. This specific professional designation was the key to their infiltration. As equerries, Gauthier and Philippe possessed high-level security clearance. They had legitimate, unquestioned reasons to move freely between the various royal properties, courtyards, and administrative zones. Their presence within the perimeter of the royal households would not trigger alarms or raise the suspicions of the king's guard. Gauthier served in the household of Prince Philip, the husband of Joan of Burgundy, while Philippe served in the retinue of Charles of Valois, the king's brother. This placement gave them the mobility required to coordinate their movements with the princesses. Furthermore, the brothers provided a staggering contrast to the Capetian princes. They were superbly educated in the chivalric arts, well-spoken, physically attractive, and attentive, embodying the exact courtly ideals that the princesses had been denied since arriving in Paris. Maintaining a conspiracy of this magnitude required flawless operational security. The logistics of the affair were complex and relied entirely on the coordination of Joan of Burgundy. Historical consensus indicates that Joan did not engage in the physical adultery herself, but her role as the primary architect and lookout was vital to the operation's survival. The women leveraged their royal authority to manipulate the security apparatus. Marguerite and Blanche would utilize the unbending religious protocols of the era as their cover. They would formally dismiss their ladies-in-waiting and personal guards, citing a requirement for complete silence to engage in private prayer or religious contemplation at the Tour de Nesle. Disobeying or questioning the religious devotion of the future Queen of France was not an option for the palace staff. Once the internal perimeter of the tower was secured and locked from the inside by Joan, the Daunet brothers executed their approach. To avoid the heavily guarded terrestrial city gates, the armed street patrols, and the curfew enforcers on the left bank, the knights utilized the river. Under the cover of total darkness, they navigated small boats along the Seine, utilizing the river currents to arrive silently at the base of the tower. They entered through the water-level access points, completely bypassing the terrestrial surveillance network of the king. For 3 years, from 1311 to 1314, this meticulously structured operation functioned without detection. The king's intelligence network, remarkably effective at tracking foreign spies, financial corruption, and Templar conspiracies, possessed a massive blind spot regarding the internal domestic spheres of the royal women. The state assumed that the inflexible religious morality imposed upon the court, combined with the sheer terror of the king's authority, was sufficient to guarantee the compliance of the princesses. This assumption allowed Marguerite to commit an act that went far beyond the moral parameters of adultery. In the jurisprudence of 14th century France, her actions constituted lèse-majesté, high treason. The legal aspect is critical, as a royal marriage was a matter of state security. The queen's primary duty was to secure a legitimate royal bloodline for the crown. Through her secret relationship with a Norman equerry, Marguerite severely threatened the future of the succession. If Marguerite conceived a child during this period, the French state would possess no biological guarantee that the child carried Capetian blood. An illegitimate child inheriting the throne of France would invalidate the fundamental feudal contract between the monarchy and the nobility. It was a crime that threatened the structural integrity of the entire nation, carrying the potential to incite a massive civil war over the legitimacy of the crown. Marguerite was fully aware of the stakes. She was risking her titles, her freedom, and her life for physical and emotional autonomy. For 36 months, the thick stone walls of the Tour de Nesle held the secret. However, the meticulous operational security they had designed would eventually be destroyed not by the king's spies, but by their own devastating lack of discipline regarding the material artifacts of the royal court. While the geographic quarantine around the Tour de Nesle provided unbroken physical security, maintaining such a high-stakes conspiracy over a multi-year period demanded an exhausting level of psychological endurance. As the operation stretched into its 3rd year, the initial uncompromising adherence to covert protocols began to severely erode. The princesses and their accomplices grew acclimated to the daily risk, operating under a dangerously profound illusion of invulnerability that would soon blind them to a catastrophic error. They no longer perceived the lethal consequences of their actions, failing to realize that their meticulously constructed security apparatus was about to shatter. The catalyst for the exposure occurred during a period of intense public visibility for the French royal family. In the summer of 1313, King Philip IV hosted a massive 8-day festival in Paris surrounding the religious holiday of Pentecost. This event was not a standard court gathering. It was an intensely calculated display of geopolitical supremacy. The primary stated objective of the festival was the formal knighting of the king's 3 sons, including Marguerite's husband, Crown Prince Louis. Furthermore, it served to project an image of absolute dynastic stability to the rest of Europe following the financially exhausting wars in Flanders and the deeply controversial suppression of the Knights Templar. The festival drew high-ranking nobility, diplomats, and monarchs from across the continent. Marguerite, as the wife of the crown prince, occupied a prominent, incredibly visible role in these ceremonies. She was required to participate in days of public feasting, diplomatic receptions, and tournament observations. Among the visiting dignitaries was Isabella, Queen Consort of England. Isabella was the only surviving daughter of King Philip IV and the sister-in-law to the 3 Burgundian princesses. She traveled to Paris accompanied by her husband, King Edward II of England, ostensibly to negotiate unresolved territorial disputes in Gascony, but also to participate in the dynastic celebration of her brothers. To mark the occasion and demonstrate the wealth of the English crown, Queen Isabella presented specialized, custom-manufactured gifts to Marguerite, Joan, and Blanche. She gifted them exquisite aumônières. The fatal nature of this evidence was deeply rooted in the strict material culture of the 14th century aristocracy. An aumônière was a small purse, traditionally suspended from a leather or silk belt at the waist. Originally designed to hold coins for almsgiving, by the 1300s, these purses had evolved into highly visible indicators of supreme aristocratic rank. The purses presented by Isabella were not standard mercantile goods. They were bespoke masterworks produced exclusively by elite royal artisans in London. They were meticulously embroidered using heavily regulated materials, specifically gold and silver bullion thread. The fabric was heavily encrusted with imported precious stones and pearls. Most crucially, these aumônières featured visibly specific, unique heraldic designs and geometric patterns that identified their origin. They were entirely unique artifacts. In an era before mass production, a royal gift of this caliber was instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with courtly craftsmanship. It functioned almost as a localized passport, denoting the wearer's direct connection to the sovereign. The fundamental rule of covert operations is the uncompromising separation of the clandestine environment from the public sphere. Marguerite and Blanche violated this core principle. Following the departure of the English delegation, the princesses took the bespoke aumônières they had received from Isabella and gifted them to Gauthier and Philippe d'Aunay. This transfer of royal property was a severe logistical error. Marguerite was transferring an easily identifiable, unique asset directly into the possession of men who operated outside the immediate royal family. The motivation behind this transfer points to a psychological shift within the affair. The princesses were no longer satisfied with merely conducting the liaison in secret. They desired to claim a degree of ownership over their lovers by marking them with items of extreme financial and social value. However, the subsequent actions of the Norman knights escalated the error into a systemic exposure. Gauthier and Philippe d'Aunay held the rank of equerries. While they possessed good aristocratic lineage, they lacked the vast agricultural wealth required to commission luxury items of this specific caliber. Possessing the typical arrogance of favored courtiers who believed they were untouchable, the d'Aunay brothers failed to recognize the physical danger the items represented. Instead of hiding the royal gifts or utilizing them safely in private, the knights integrated the purses into their formal court attire. They began wearing the instantly recognizable silk aumônières openly on their belts during public banquets and administrative duties. They were parading physical evidence of their proximity to the royal women directly in front of the highest nobility of the realm. The critical intelligence breach did not occur in Paris, but across the English Channel. Late in the year 1313, a French diplomatic delegation was dispatched to London to continue the ongoing negotiations regarding the administration of the Gascon territories. Gauthier and Philippe d'Aunay traveled as part of the logistical support staff for this delegation. During a formal diplomatic reception at the English court in Westminster, Queen Isabella was observing the French retinue. Her attention was drawn to the two Norman equerries. Utilizing her keenly analytical capability, Isabella immediately recognized the distinct visual signature of the English gold embroidery and the specific jewel arrangements on the hips of the two knights. They were the exact aumônières she had commissioned and personally gifted to her sisters-in-law mere months prior. Isabella processed this visual data and formulated an immediate, logical deduction. She understood the unyielding economic realities of the French court. Low-ranking equerries possessed an annual stipend that could not cover a fraction of the cost required to purchase such bespoke masterworks. Theft was extremely improbable. Stealing directly from the private chambers of the future Queen of France would trigger a massive immediate royal investigation, which had not occurred. Therefore, the items had been given willingly. Isabella also understood the inflexible behavioral protocols governing royal women. A reigning princess would never voluntarily surrender a profoundly intimate, personally significant royal gift to a household servant unless an illicit relationship existed. The presence of the purses proved an unauthorized, intimate transaction had taken place between the highest level of the Capetian dynasty and the service layer of the court, faced with direct visual evidence of high treason against her own father's dynasty. Isabella executed a flawless tactical response. She maintained a terrifying strategic silence. She did not confront the Donnay brothers. She did not raise an alarm or alert the leaders of the French diplomatic delegation. Isabella recognized that a sudden public accusation without secondary corroboration would be disastrous. It would provide the Donnay brothers and the Burgundian princesses with the critical time required to coordinate their defenses, destroy any remaining correspondence, silence lower-level witnesses, and fabricate ironclad alibis. Furthermore, accusing the powerful House of Burgundy without concrete proof could isolate Isabella diplomatically. Instead, she allowed the French delegation to return to Paris undisturbed. Isabella then quietly activated a clandestine network of informants and loyalists operating within the French capital. Over the subsequent months, she tasked this network with observing the specific movements of her sisters-in-law. She required confirmation of the physical logistics of the affair. Her informants meticulously tracked the dismissals of the royal guards, the unaccounted hours during the night, and the localized movements around the Tour de Nesle, building a comprehensive dossier of circumstantial evidence to support the physical proof of the purses. Early in the year 1314, Isabella possessed sufficient intelligence to act. She crossed the English Channel and returned to France. She traveled under the official bureaucratic pretext of finalizing the Gascon treaties, ensuring her arrival did not trigger immediate suspicion among the Burgundian faction. Upon arriving at the Palais de la Cité, Isabella bypassed standard court protocols. She requested and secured a private, immensely secure audience directly with her father, King Philip IV. Behind closed doors, completely isolated from the legistes and the regular court administration, Isabella laid the intelligence on the table. She presented the king with the logical deduction regarding the aumônières and the corroborating reports tracking the nocturnal movements of Marguerite, Blanche, and Joan. She provided the king with the exact data required to conclude that his daughters-in-law were actively compromising the Capetian succession. King Philip IV did not react with a spontaneous outburst of rage. He was a master of statecraft and jurisprudence. He processed the intelligence provided by his daughter through a purely political lens. Philip recognized that he was facing a crisis of unparalleled magnitude. He was not merely dealing with domestic adultery. He was preparing to move against the direct bloodline of the Duke of Burgundy and the Count of Burgundy. These were two of the most heavily armed, territorially vast vassals on his eastern frontier. The entire security apparatus he had spent decades constructing, the foundational Burgundian alliances, and the interlocking dynastic marriages, was suddenly rendered a threat to the crown. If Philip ordered the arrest of the princesses based solely on the hearsay of his daughter and the existence of gifted purses, the Burgundian lords would likely reject the charges as a political fabrication. They could interpret the arrests as an unwarranted attack on their sovereignty and launch a massive military rebellion. The French state could be plunged into a civil war over a lack of concrete evidence. To neutralize the political fallout and prevent a military uprising, Philip required irrefutable, legally unassailable proof. He needed to catch the conspirators in flagrante delicto, in the very act of committing the crime. To achieve this, the king deployed the most capable administrative mind in his government, Enguerrand de Marigny. Marigny was the Grand Chamberlain of France and the king's chief minister. He was a ruthlessly efficient bureaucrat who controlled the internal security apparatus of the state. King Philip briefed Marigny on the intelligence and ordered him to execute a covert sting operation. Marigny completely blanketed the area surrounding the Tour de Nesle with specialized state surveillance. He did not use standard royal guards in uniform. He utilized plainclothes agents and river patrollers. Marigny's agents meticulously logged the maritime traffic on the river Seine during the curfew hours. They tracked the specific boats approaching the left bank. They monitored the water gate at the base of the Tour de Nesle. They recorded the synchronized movements of the princesses, leaving the main palace, and the Downe brothers altering their patrol routes. For a period of several weeks in the early spring of 1314, the French state quietly gathered the final logistical data required to authorize an armed intervention. Marguerite of Burgundy continued to orchestrate her meetings, entirely unaware that the secure perimeter of the Tour de Nesle had been breached, and that the unrivaled power of the Capetian state was methodically closing in around her. The operation was executed in April 1314. It was not a public arrest carried out during the daylight hours, which would have allowed the accused to invoke their aristocratic privileges or demand immediate legal counsel. It was a precisely coordinated, militarized nighttime raid designed to rely entirely on the element of total surprise and overwhelming physical force. Under the strict cover of darkness, specialized detachments of the King's Royal Guard were deployed to two separate locations simultaneously. The primary objective was to secure the physical bodies of the suspects before any communication could occur between them. One detachment converged on the Tour de Nesle. They bypassed the standard entry protocols, utilizing the specific logistical intelligence gathered by Marigny's agents. They breached the perimeter and intercepted Gauthier and Philippe Downe. The knights were caught entirely off guard. The royal guards executed the arrests with immediate, calculated aggression. They stripped the Downe brothers of their weapons, their belts, and their royal insignias on the spot, signaling the instant suspension of their aristocratic status. The knights were immediately bound, gagged to prevent them from shouting orders or warnings, and dragged away into the shadows. Simultaneously, a second heavily armed unit stormed the private royal apartments within the Palais de la Cité and the Tour de Nesle itself to secure the princesses. Marguerite, Blanche, and Joan of Burgundy were seized with a speed that precluded any resistance. The guards were operating under clear executive orders. The royal women were not to be physically harmed, but they were to be subdued and removed from their quarters immediately. The most critical phase of the raid occurred immediately after the physical arrests. The French state instantly imposed a condition of complete, incommunicado isolation upon the three princesses. They were separated from one another and placed under heavy guard in secure holding rooms within the palace. This rapid quarantine was not designed as a punishment. It was a paramount strategic necessity. King Philip IV understood the exact geopolitical mathematics of his actions. He had just arrested the daughters of the Duke of Burgundy and the Count of Burgundy. The Duchy of Burgundy possessed a massive standing army, deep financial reserves, and a fiercely independent political apparatus. If Marguerite or her sisters-in-law managed to dispatch a loyal servant, a courier, or even a carrier pigeon to the city of Dijon, before the crown had solidified its legal case, the Duke of Burgundy could interpret the arrests as an unprovoked hostile act against his sovereignty. He could mobilize his forces, ally with the Holy Roman Empire, and march on Paris. To prevent this, Marigny ordered the total lockdown of the royal administrative center. The gates of the Palais de la Cité were sealed. No messengers were permitted to leave the island without explicit, signed authorization from the Grand Chamberlain. The personal servants, ladies-in-waiting, and confessors attached to the princesses were immediately detained and interrogated to ensure no unauthorized communications had breached the perimeter. For the crucial days following the raid, the Duke of Burgundy remained entirely blind to the fact that his daughter had been arrested for treason. With the perimeter secured and the geopolitical threat temporarily contained, the French state activated its judicial machinery. The unprecedented brutality of the subsequent events was driven by a distinctly weaponized legal theory deployed by the Crown. Under the administration of Philip IV, the French légistes, royal lawyers, had actively revived and weaponized ancient Roman law, specifically the concepts of supreme sovereign authority found in the Justinian Code. They utilized these legal frameworks to centralize power around the person of the king. Within this legal architecture, the adultery of a queen was not classified as a moral failing or a domestic dispute to be handled by the church. It was classified as lèse-majesté, high treason against the state. The legal logic was uncompromising. The physical body of the queen consort, and specifically her reproductive capability, was the exclusive property of the crown. Her womb was the designated vessel for the transmission of the Capetian bloodline. By introducing the biological material of a Norman equerry into this vessel, Marguerite had committed a direct attack on the structural integrity of the French government. If an illegitimate child were presented as the heir to the throne, the fundamental feudal contract binding the nobility to the monarch would be rendered legally void. Therefore, the actions of the Downe brothers were legally equivalent to an armed assault on the king's person or an attempt to overthrow the government. Because the formal charge was high treason, the standard legal protections afforded to the nobility were instantaneously suspended. Under normal circumstances, a knight possessed the right to a trial by his peers, the right to legal representation, and complete immunity from physical torture. However, lèse-majesté superseded all feudal privileges. The state argued that those who attempted to destroy the crown forfeited their right to be treated as subjects of the crown. Gauthier and Philippe Daunet were legally reclassified. They were no longer considered knights or nobles. They were categorized as enemies of the state. This legal reclassification authorized the transfer of the brothers from the custody of the royal guard directly into the jurisdiction of the Provost of Paris, headquartered at the Châtelet. The Châtelet was a massive, grim fortress on the right bank of the Seine that served as the primary prison, courthouse, and interrogation center for the capital. The knights were thrown into its subterranean holding cells, areas completely devoid of natural light and located below the water level of the river. In the medieval French legal system, securing a conviction for treason, especially when the geopolitical stakes involved the House of Burgundy, required an undeniable, legally binding confession from the accused. Circumstantial evidence, even the eyewitness accounts of royal spies or the physical presence of the aumônières, was deemed insufficient to justify the execution of high-ranking courtiers and the potential repudiation of a queen. To obtain this confession from hostile, heavily trained military men who understood that admitting guilt meant certain death, the state relied on the quaestio. The quaestio was the heavily regulated, legally mandated application of state-sanctioned torture. It is crucial to understand that in 14th century Paris, torture was not carried out as an act of chaotic, sadistic vengeance by the king. It was executed as a clinical, administrative procedure. The extraction of the truth was viewed as a mechanical process governed by precise bureaucratic protocols. The interrogation was conducted in a specialized chamber within the Châtelet. Present in the room were the royal executioners, the physical operators, a magistrate representing the crown to ensure the procedure adhered to legal guidelines, and a designated scribe. The scribe's duty was paramount. He was required to meticulously record every question asked, every physical application of force, and every word uttered by the accused, ensuring the final confession was legally valid. Gauthier and Philippe Daunet were subjected to the ultimate limits of human biological endurance. The state utilized the standard, brutally effective instruments of the quaestio to systematically dismantle their physical and psychological resilience. They were first subjected to the rack. The brothers were strapped to a wooden frame equipped with heavy ratchets and pulleys. The executioners slowly engaged the mechanisms, applying continuous, increasing tension to the knight's limbs. The mechanics stretched their bodies until their muscle tissue tore, and the major joints of their shoulders, hips, and knees violently dislocated. The procedure was designed to inflict maximum, sustained agony without immediately causing fatal blood loss. When the rack failed to produce the required comprehensive confession, the executioners escalated to the strappado. The knights' arms were bound tightly behind their backs. A rope was attached to their bound wrists, and they were hoisted high to the stone ceiling of the chamber. They were then suddenly dropped into a free fall, but the rope was snapped taut just above the floor. The violent, abrupt deceleration utilized the entire weight of their own bodies to shatter their shoulder sockets and tear the surrounding musculature. Furthermore, they were subjected to water torture. The executioners forced massive volumes of liquid down their throats through linen funnels, a procedure that induced the agonizing physiological sensation of drowning, caused severe internal hemorrhaging, and created immense crushing pressure on their internal organs. Throughout these procedures, the magistrate continually presented them with the specific intelligence gathered by Queen Isabella and Enguerrand de Marigny, demanding they validate the state's narrative. The Daunay brothers were seasoned knights, but the Quaestia was designed to bypass military discipline by entirely breaking the biological capacity of the human nervous system. Physically ruined, their bodies shattered, and facing the inevitability of their own execution, Gauthier and Philippe Daunay finally surrendered to the state apparatus. The scribe recorded their statements. The brothers provided comprehensive, detailed confessions that corroborated the intelligence gathered by the crown. They formally admitted to the 3-year illicit liaison with Marguerite and Blanche of Burgundy. They confirmed the logistics of the Tour de Nesle, the evasion of the guards, and the transfer of the royal purses. Crucially, the interrogation also secured the implication of the third princess. The brothers explicitly named Joan of Burgundy in their formal statements. They detailed her exact operational role, confirming that while she did not engage in the physical adultery, she acted as the primary architect, the facilitator, and the lookout who secured the perimeter of the tower. The scribes finalized the documentation. The brothers, unable to use their shattered hands effectively, signed the legal documents, essentially authenticating their own death warrants. These extracted confessions represented the ultimate victory for King Philip's legistes. The French crown now possessed the fatal, unassailable legal instruments required to move against the House of Burgundy. The state had converted mere suspicion and intelligence into concrete, documented legal fact. The king held the evidence necessary to justify the cleansing of the Capetian bloodline, setting the stage for an unprecedented display of public, administrative violence designed to eradicate the scandal from the historical record. Armed with the legally binding documents signed within the Châtelet, King Philip IV transitioned immediately from covert investigation to public retaliation. A quiet execution was never an option. Treason against the crown demanded a highly visible, visceral display of unquestioned state power to deter any future defiance from the nobility. He required a spectacle so horrifying that it would burn the consequences of lèse-majesté into the collective memory of the French aristocracy for generations to come. On April 19, 1314, guards moved Gauthier and Philippe to the public square of Pontoise. A massive crowd of nobles and commoners gathered to witness the event. The king designed this execution as a mandatory public spectacle. It was meant to show the absolute and terrifying consequences of threatening the royal succession. The executioners first targeted the knight's masculinity and aristocratic honor. While the brothers were fully conscious, they were publicly castrated. Their severed genitals were then thrown to the dogs. This specific brutality was a calculated, symbolic punishment for daring to defile the future queens of France. Next, the state systematically stripped away their knightly identity. The executioners flayed the brothers alive, peeling strips of skin from their torsos. They were then bound to massive wooden wheels. Heavy iron bars were used to shatter their limbs, carefully avoiding vital organs to prolong their intense physiological agony. Finally, the brothers were disemboweled and decapitated. Their mutilated bodies were hung upside down on the gibbets of Montfaucon, exposed to the weather and scavengers. Their severed heads were spiked on the city walls. By strictly denying them a Christian burial, the king intended to erase their souls permanently. Punishing the Burgundian princesses, however, required a much more careful geopolitical approach. King Philip IV knew that publicly executing Marguerite of Burgundy was too dangerous. She was the direct daughter of the powerful Duke of Burgundy. Killing her could easily provoke a devastating civil war on the eastern border. Because of her royal blood, Marguerite was shielded from a physical execution. Instead, the king decided to inflict a total, highly public social death. She was brought before the Parlement of Paris to face her judgment. Her punishment would be entirely different from the other women involved in the scandal. Joan of Burgundy had strong political backing and was eventually acquitted. Blanche was imprisoned, but her treason was less threatening since her husband was far from the throne. Marguerite, however, was married to the crown prince. Her actions directly threatened the primary succession, meaning she would receive entirely no mercy. Standing before the highest court, Marguerite was officially stripped of her aristocratic titles. She lost her future claim to the throne and all her massive personal wealth. The state then publicly and violently dismantled her royal identity. Guards tore off her expensive silk robes and confiscated her crown and jewels. She was then forced into a rough, abrasive burlap sack, a garment mandated for common criminals. The ultimate humiliation came immediately after. An executioner stepped forward and used crude iron shears to hack off her hair. Her scalp was left completely bald and jagged in front of the jeering assembly. In 14th century Europe, long hair symbolized a woman's femininity, religious virtue, and noble status. By shaving her head publicly, the crown reduced the princess to the status of a condemned heretic. The state successfully erased her noble identity. She went from being the future Queen of France to a nameless, disgraced prisoner. Stripped of everything, Marguerite was banished to Château Gaillard in Normandy. The state chose this harsh, cliffside military fortress to ensure her absolute, permanent isolation. She was not given standard aristocratic confinement with servants or basic comforts. Instead, she was thrown directly into the deepest, most inaccessible dungeons. These subterranean cells, known as oubliettes, were designed to make the outside world forget the prisoner entirely. Marguerite was deprived of natural sunlight and trapped in perpetual dampness. The cell was directly exposed to the freezing winds of the Norman winter. She received minimal food and no adequate clothing. This brutal physical environment was deliberately calculated to quickly destroy her health. The crown intended for this freezing dungeon to be the quiet end of her life. However, rigid feudal laws soon triggered a massive constitutional crisis. This unexpected event quickly brought the forgotten prisoner back to the center of French politics. In November 1314, King Philip IV died suddenly from a stroke. His eldest son immediately ascended to the throne as King Louis X. A major legal paradox instantly materialized. Because the church had never dissolved their marriage, the shivering prisoner in Normandy automatically became the undisputed, legal Queen of France. King Louis X desperately needed a legitimate male heir to secure his new reign. He planned to marry Princess Clemence of Hungary, but Catholic law explicitly forbade divorce. Only the Pope could grant a royal annulment. Unfortunately, the papacy was completely vacant following the recent death of Pope Clement V. With no pope to approve an annulment, the king's advisors were powerless. As long as Marguerite lived, she remained the legal queen. Her existence was an immovable roadblock for the future of the dynasty. Conveniently, in mid-August 1315, the 25-year-old queen suddenly died in her freezing cell. The official royal dispatch claimed she died from a severe respiratory illness and exhaustion. However, historical evidence strongly suggests she was assassinated to clear the king's path. Guards likely smothered her, a method leaving no physical marks. Just 5 days after her deeply suspicious death on August 14, Louis X married Clemence of Hungary. The fallout from Marguerite's affair ultimately proved disastrous for the Capetian dynasty. After Louis X and his short-lived infant son died in 1316, the royal succession was thrown into chaos. Marguerite's surviving daughter, Joan, was barred from the throne due to profound suspicions of her illegitimacy. To guarantee this, lawyers established a new precedent permanently banning female succession. This drastic legal maneuver ultimately doomed the 300-year-old royal house. By 1328, the direct male line of the Capetian dynasty went completely extinct. The English king firmly rejected these new succession laws and claimed the French throne for himself. Ultimately, Marguerite's illicit affair provided the exact geopolitical spark that ignited the 100 Years' War.